We're going to start off by talking about Palo Alto and what was essential for the United States victory. Basically, all you need to know for the test is that the victory at Palo Alto in the Mexican War was due to mobile U.S. cannon, also referred to as horse artillery in the book. There was also favorable terrain. So, at first, General Santa Anna looked at the terrain. It was wide open and generally ideal for cavalry, and Mexicans seemed to have superior artillery in terms of firepower. However, the United States had cannons and artillery that was lightweight and could quickly be moved, and that turned out to be really helpful for them. The lightweight horse artillery, the United States cannons here, were also had much better accuracy, and they mentioned how the Mexican cannonballs would hit the ground and miss American troops, and then the cannonballs would so slowly ricochet that the Americans actually had time to actually move out of the way and dodge the cannonballs. So basically, just know that the United States had lightweight cannons that could be moved quickly over the terrain that was open, and that led to a United States victory at Palo Alto. So the notes that we have here show mobile artillery or horse artillery was essential for U.S. victory. The United States had lighter cannons, lighter weight cannons, and they had better range and muzzle velocity, and more importantly, it was very efficient at moving over territory, so it could be quickly moved where it needed to be. For the second sub-bullet that's testable, Palo Alto's terrain was open, and it favored superior Mexican cavalry, like I said. However, it favored more the American horse artillery, meaning the lightweight artillery that could be moved easily over the open terrain. So that's what you need to know here. The terrain at Palo Alto, again, was open and clear, which was favorable for Mexican cavalry. However, the United States won because they had lightweight cannons that could be easily moved over the open terrain, known as horse artillery. That's artillery that can be easily moved and is mobile. And that's why the Americans won the battle at Palo Alto. Next was Taylor's Monterrey campaign. Initially, there were supply problems because the Americans weren't prepared for the war, and they had a whole bunch of troops delivered so fast and so quickly all at once, and there wasn't enough time to orchestrate them and organize them to where they needed to be. It was kind of a mess, just a bunch of troops all showing up at one time without much of a plan on where to put them all. So that was the supply problem they had. However, Taylor was successful, nevertheless, in the Monterrey campaign because he maneuvered very effectively. He was able to maneuver the Mexicans into this narrow kind of funnel where they could be flanked by the horse artillery, the cannons. Also, that forcing the Mexicans into this narrow passage prevented the Mexicans from being able to flank the Americans. However, this was a very controversial battle. The battle at Monterrey was very controversial, and it really pissed off Polk because at the end, Monterrey won this battle, and then he drew up an armistice treaty with the Mexicans and allowed the Mexicans to leave, which was a problem because Polk wanted to have a very quick and simple end to the war, and whenever Taylor allowed the Mexicans to leave without being destroyed, he was basically prolonging the war. So he won the battle, but then he let the Mexicans leave and had an armistice agreement that they would put down their arms for some time, and that was essentially just prolonging the war, making it last even longer. So Taylor had the opportunity to destroy the Mexicans here and there, but for some reason he decided to drop an agreement with them and let them go, which just prolonged the war, and that really pissed off Taylor's superiors. So in the notes here, it elaborates more what's important to know. So Taylor initially had logistical problems because a lot of people showed up all at once, but it was also partly his fault too, because the textbook mentions how Taylor didn't really pay much attention to supplies and administrative demands. So he was kind of a poor logistical officer. He didn't really take into account logistics very much. However, he did redeem himself in the battle at Monterrey because he was very good at maneuvering. He used maneuvering techniques very well, and he was able to defeat the Mexican commanders due to his ability to maneuver very effectively. And ultimately, Scott Taylor did take over the town, but they let the Mexican army leave. And that was what's controversial here, because whenever he let the Mexican army leave, he was really disappointing President Polk, because President Polk, like I said, wanted a brisk and short war. He wanted the war to be ended very quickly, and by letting the Mexicans leave after they were defeated at that battle, just prolonged the war. And so that was what's controversial about Taylor's Monterey campaign. Taylor and Winfield Scott, just to avoid confusion, are on the same team. Taylor and Winfield Scott were both commanders on the United States side, and they worked together in this Monterey campaign, which is why you'll see in the notes Scott and Taylor. They're both on the same side doing the same thing. Okay? Next, we have Buena Vista. It was mostly noted for being a good use of defensive terrain. Also, mobile artillery was crucial in winning this war, and also it was a testament to how effective Taylor was as a leader. To emphasize here, the terrain showed that Mexican cavalry was favored in this terrain, and similarly as before, it kind of canalized the Mexicans into a narrow space where Americans could flank them and use their cannons to shoot them on the flanks. Also, putting them into this narrow passageway prevented the Americans from flanking prevented the Mexicans from flanking the Americans. The Americans canalized all the Mexicans into this narrow passageway, which then prevented the Mexicans from being able to go around and flank the Americans. So the trait of maneuvering was used very well here. What's also testable here that you should emphasize is that mobile U.S. Army artillery was very crucial in stopping Mexican attacks at Buena Vista. This open terrain, similarly in the first battle at Palo Alto that we studied, the terrain favored lightweight cannons that could be moved quickly, and also the U.S. artillery cannons had much greater accuracy and range than the Mexicans had. And that was key to winning the battle at Buena Vista, just like it was at Palo Alto. So this is a very similar battle to Palo Alto. Another testable point here is that Taylor was a very effective leader. He was very perseverant against Santa Anna, and this led to Santa Anna becoming very frustrated whenever he lost this battle. So Buena Vista is important because it's a testament to how good of a leader Taylor was. The United States, that's the United States commander. For the next battle, we talk about Winfield Scott's contribution to the United States whenever they were in the Mexican War. He used the principle of maneuver very efficiently, and he was very effective at planning. He was very strict and thorough when it came to planning and logistics, so he was kind of the opposite of Taylor. Taylor, like we said, didn't pay a lot of attention to logistics, whereas Scott was kind of the opposite. He was almost OCD in his ability to pay attention to detail and plan things excessively whenever he was planning battles, which led to him having excellent logistics in Winfield Scott's battles. So again, Winfield Scott had excellent logistical command. That's what he's most noted for. In his Mexico City campaign, instead of moving from street to street, he moved from building to building, which is why he's known for having such a good maneuvering ability, because the technique of moving from building to building allowed for cover and allowed for a much more efficient taking of Mexico City. So it's basically just these notes here elaborate everything that I just said. Scott was very good at planning and running logistics, much better than Taylor did at the Monterey campaign, because again, remember, Taylor was poor at dealing with logistics, which showed in the Monterey campaign. There was poor logistics in the Monterey campaign, which is what it's known for. And That's essentially what's important about this slide. Going on, Winfield Scott, Civil Affairs and Successful Peace. So one thing that made Winfield Scott so successful and what led to an end to the war was that he lured Mexican support away from their own government. Once the tides of war shifted and the United States had a lot of influence in Mexico and they were occupying Mexico, they actually did a much better job at running the government than Mexico did itself. And so the civilians there realized that when the Americans were occupying Mexico towards the end of the war, life became better for them. And so there was a lot of civil support for the United States. And Winfield Scott did such a great job at occupying Mexico and making life better for the civilians and much more effective running of the Mexican government that it actually made it more appealing for the Mexicans to end the war on the United States terms. And so they signed a big treaty where they lost about half of their Mexicans lost about half of their total land, gave it over to the United States for $15 million, and the United States gained all of their western territory that we have now and took it away from the Mexicans. And what's important about this slide here is that Winfield Scott was able to secure this favorable treaty for the United States while averting a wider war. So he concluded the war by essentially running the Mexican government so much more effectively than it was before that they were more inclined to give him what he wanted. So you attract more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. He was such a good leader that when he started occupying Mexico, he actually did a better job at running Mexico than Mexico's own government did. And for that reason, they were more inclined to give him what he wanted. That's essentially what this slide is saying, what it's about here. That's how you can think about this. How he lured Mexican support away from their own government because he did a better job at running their country than Mexican government did. So this check on learning, it tells you, these check on learnings are kind of hints about what the question's going to ask. So, for Taylor and his victories at Palo Alto and Buena Vista, discuss his use of artillery, terrain, and battlefield command. So Taylor had very good battlefield command, although he didn't pay much attention to logistics, right? He wasn't very detail-oriented with logistics. Also, for his use of artillery, he used lightweight cannons that had good range and accuracy, known as horse artillery, that could be quickly moved over open terrain. So that's open terrain, right? Then, to take Monterrey, did Taylor initially maneuver well? So yes, he did maneuver well to take Monterrey. That's what it's most known for, how well Taylor used the principle of maneuvering. When he took the town, why were his actions controversial? So remember, when Taylor took the town, his actions were controversial because he drew up an agreement with the Mexicans, he let them go, and he agreed to an armistice, putting down their arms, and that really pissed off President Polk because essentially at Monterrey, Taylor had the ability to annihilate the Mexicans and put an end to the war. However, by doing this armistice agreement and by letting the Mexicans go, he was essentially just prolonging the war, and that really pissed off President Polk, and that's why that was a controversial event. Compare Taylor's Monterrey campaign and Scott's Mexico City campaign. So both of them were successful, right? However, as far as planning and logistics goes, Taylor was not very good with planning and logistics. He didn't like to belabor logistics and planning, whereas Winfield Scott was the exact opposite, right? Winfield Scott was noted by Robert E. Lee and other superiors as being very thorough and very meticulous when it came to planning and logistics. Did both succeed only due to luck? No, it wasn't due to luck. So one thing that Taylor and Scott did have in common is that they were very good at using the principle of maneuvering. They were very clever whenever they came up with maneuvering tactics to win campaigns. And that's why they won. Primarily also the use of lightweight artillery. So describe Scott's conduct of administration and diplomatic affairs after he took Mexico City. Basically, he did a much better job at running Mexico City than their own government did. And that led to him receiving Mexican support, and eventually he was such a great leader and did such a great job at occupying Mexico City that he received a lot of support from Mexico, and that made them more inclined to give him what he wanted, and it averted an even wider, more longer-lasting, uglier war, and they were able to sign up a very favorable treaty where Mexicans lost about half of all their land, and United States gained it for only like $15 million. So really favorable treaty that he got just by running Mexico City, even better than Mexico's own government did. So that is what's going to be important about question number 7 on the test. Moving forward, we transition into the Civil War, and we're going to go over some of the most important battles in the Civil War. But before that, we're going to talk about what the Anaconda Plan is. So the Anaconda Plan was a plan drawn up by the Union. It was known as the Anaconda Plan because it was very long. The way it was planned out meant that the war would be very long in order to achieve all the goals that the Anaconda Plan set out. So Anaconda was kind of a derogatory term that critics called the plan that the Union drew up to win the war because it would take a very long time, just like an anaconda being very long. As far as Union strategies go, the Anaconda Plan was initially ridiculed, as I said, but the ultimate goal was that the Union Navy would set up a blockade very quickly and then tighten it effectively over time. And this was very efficient. The whole strategy here was that the Union Navy set up a blockade which prevented the South from being able to import goods and basically cut off the South from having contact from the outside world. So they couldn't import goods, and they couldn't really... It disrupted their lines of communication by setting up a blockade around them. They basically did the same thing that the French did to the British in the Revolutionary War. They set up a blockade around the South over the waters and prevented importation and disrupted lines of communications for the South. And over time, they made it more and more of an aggressive tactic, and it turned out very favorable for the Union, and it really hurt the South a lot throughout the Civil War. So what's important to belabor about this is in bold here in the notes, the Anaconda Plan. Winfield Scott pushed this Anaconda Plan. It was all about seizing the Mississippi River and also establishing a coastal blockade to split and strangle the Confederacy. So that's what I just talked about. The coastal blockade was the way of preventing the South from importing, and it disrupted their lines of communication. That's what the Union Navy did. However, it was called the Anaconda Plan because people thought that it would take too long because it was too detailed and had too many steps to it. But the most important points for the test is, first of all, the Navy implemented the Anaconda Plan blockade very quickly, right away in 1861 at the beginning of the war. And it was the most important contribution towards why the Union won the Civil War. Also, what's important to know here is that the blockade became increasingly effective. So over time, it was more and more critical to winning the war, and it hurt the South even more and more as the war dragged on. So it was really important that they set up this naval blockade right away and very quickly. That's why it was so effective. That's what they want you to know about this slide. The Navy, also for your information, didn't have a lot of ships early in the war, but it was just enough ships for them to be able to disrupt Southern trade and Southern lines of communication with this blockade. The war was long, and the Union Navy got a lot more ships over time, which is why this blockade became more and more effective over time, because throughout the war, the Union Navy grew larger and larger, which allowed them to add more and more ships to the blockade, and the Anaconda Plan became more effective over time because the Union Navy grew over time and allowed for a tighter, more effective blockade and essentially better isolation of the South and disruption of their lines of communication. That's what's important to know about the Anaconda Plan. As for technology, remember there's 3 levels to war, right? There's the strategic level, which is the overall war. Then there's the operational level, which is the campaign. And then there's the there's the tactical level, which is the battle. There's the operational level, which is the campaign. And there's the strategic level, which is the battle. within the campaigns. So strategic level is the overall war, the operational level is the campaigns making up the war, and the tactical level are all the battles that make up the campaigns being in the operational level. So as far as the operational level goes, railroads had a huge impact and it was really important in the Civil War. The railroads were the objectives and the facilitators for many campaigns. So basically railroads are what made campaigns feasible. Railroads allowed for the transportation of troops. It allowed for the transportation of supplies where they were needed. So logistics and Civil War is all dependent on railroads, basically, which allows the operational level to function. And remember, the operational level is the campaign. So again, there's the strategic level, which is the overall war. There's the operational level, which is the campaign. And then there's the tactical level, which is the battles that make up the campaign. Now, another example of technology that we talk about is the telegraph. Telegraphs had a huge impact at the operational level for campaigns because it allows you to coordinate rail travel and also armies. With the telegraph, you have better communication, so you can actually plan where your railroads will be used to transport troops and supplies throughout the campaign. Also, it allows for better management of armies because you have quicker, more effective communication, correct? However, they mentioned here that at the tactical level, telegraphs can't really be used. So tactical level, remember, is the battles that make up the campaign. So at the smallest level possible, tactical means the actual battles that are occurring. And at this level, telegraphs aren't really effective. They're too cumbersome for battlefield maneuver, and the Union tried to use them in battles, but it doesn't work at this level because telegraphs weren't sophisticated enough to allow for effective communication in battles at this point in time. So just realize that telegraphs and railroads are effective at the operational level being the campaign level. So again, it goes strategic level, which is the overall war, operational level, which is the campaigns making up the war, and then tactical level, which is the battles making up the campaigns within the war. They talk a lot about other technology like the rifled muskets. So remember, muskets are quick to load. It's good for muzzle-to-muzzle battle where you're in formations and in lines and you're close to your enemy because you can reload really quickly. However, the range and accuracy isn't that great on a musket. However, rifles are the opposite. It takes a long time to load them. You get about 1 shot per minute as opposed to the musket's 3 shots per minute because rifles take a longer time to load. However, rifles have greater range and accuracy. So they made this new invention called a rifled musket that was primarily the arm that was used in the Civil War. It allowed for quick loading because it used what's called a mini ball, which is able to be loaded in front like a musket through the barrel. And the rifled musket still has the spiral that allows for the bullet to be spiraled and go straighter and longer. However, the mini ball is able to still easily slide into the barrel. However, it is able to be just large enough that it still can go through the spirals in the rifle, in the barrel, which allows it to have that spin, which gives it better range and accuracy. So again, the rifled musket was the use of technology that allowed for efficient reloading, but still kept the same range that you see in rifles. But there was a problem that how do you use this with battle tactics that are ideal for muzzles? The tactics that they used with the rifled musket was very cumbersome. It had large linear formations, and at this point in the war, all the soldiers they had were inexperienced, as well as the leaders. So soldiers and leaders were both inexperienced, and the type of linear tactics that you use a muzzle in take a lot of experience, a lot of drills, a lot of people with a lot of know-how, and so these sophisticated battle tactics were kind of cumbersome in the Civil War because the Civil War had a lot of people that were not very experienced with this type of warfare. But what's important to know about the rifled musket is that it uses muzzle loading, so it's a little bit easier to load and it has greater range. And so for that reason, it was what was primarily used in the Civil War. So here, emphasizing what's important for the test, the rifled musket was the most commonly used small arm in the Civil War. It used a mini ball, which enabled the soldiers to reload a rifled musket really quickly, and it still had really good range and accuracy. The round fit loosely in the barrel for reload. What's also testable here is that Army leaders tried to create infantry tactics that accounted for new weapons like the rifled muskets, but the infantry tactics were very sophisticated and required a lot of drills, a lot of experience and practice, and that wasn't something that soldiers and leaders really had at this point in the Civil War, and so these tactics were kind of cumbersome. The tactics included adding small groups of skirmishers in front of the usually regiment-sized main force. As you can see here, these little arrowheads in front of the two lines, those are smaller skirmishing units that are in front of two lines of full-size regiments behind them. And this is a very sophisticated battle tactic that takes a lot of experience in drilling, right? The main force advanced in traditional line formation, but at double quick to reduce the time in the rifled musket's kill zone. Further, since musket reload was still time-consuming and not user-friendly, the rifled musket-equipped enemy force were supposed to be intimidated, overtasked, and overwhelmed by the skirmishers and quick main force advance. So, this is a way to compensate for the long amount of time it took to load the rifled musket. And it was trying to overwhelm the enemy while other people were reloading their rifled muskets. So essentially a way to make up for the time lag you have when reloading rifled muskets. However, like I said, the main problem with this was that it took a lot of practice and experience to master this battle technique. So what's important to emphasize here, these battle tactics required considerable practice, something that a lot of the regiments didn't have time to do in the Civil War, and large regiment-sized moves were tricky, and they could overwhelm the newly appointed commanders who didn't have experience with these types of drills, and attacks were aimed to hit a weak spot, and they developed too slowly to exploit a fleeting tactical advantage. So for this check on learning, for question number 8 on the test, some things that are important to understand. Did Army tactics account for rifled muskets at all? Yes, they did. They had that funny battle tactic here with the arrowheads of small skirmisher units that are in front of two lines of full regiments. What hurt the tactic's effectiveness was that it took a lot of experience and practice, something that the commanders were not prepared for, and something that the soldiers didn't have experience with. As far as the unit size goes, the small skirmisher units at the front are small units at the front. The full regiments in the back are larger. Again, they required considerable practice, something that many rapidly formed regiments often lacked time to do. Large regiment-sized moves like this were tricky because the two lines behind the arrowheads are large regiments with small skirmishers in the front. So these type of large coordinated tactics that require a lot of people, they take a lot of skill from commanders, right? They take a lot of practice from everyone involved, a lot of rehearsals because there's so many people involved in this type of tactic, which is very cumbersome and a little overly complicated, right? It violates the principle of simplicity on the battlefield. and that was very overwhelming, having to coordinate these type of large-scale tactics. It was very overwhelming for newly appointed commanders, which is what was happening a lot in the Civil War. The Civil War involved a lot of newly appointed commanders who had to take over their units very quickly, and this was a lot to put on them, right? It was overly complicated. That's what's important to know for the test about these tactics. Next, on this check on learning, did railroads and telegraphs affect operational level events? Yes, railroads and telegraphs were very critical for operational level events. They were very helpful in assisting operational level events. Again, remember the operational level is the campaign level. So campaigns hinged, they were really dependent on the use of railroads and telegraphs. Without railroads and telegraphs, campaigns weren't really feasible or effective. They weren't really something that was practical without the use of railroads and telegraphs. As far as the Anaconda Plan strategy goes, it was increasingly effective in the Civil War because as the Union Navy grew in numbers, they were able to establish a much more effective blockade. Was its blockade effective early in the war? Yes, it was effective at first, and then it just became increasingly more and more effective as time went on. Why? Again, like I said, because the Union Navy grew over time. Throughout the Civil War, they got more and more ships, and that allowed the blockade to become more effective. Did the Union Navy implement it quickly? Yes, they did. The Union Navy implemented the Anaconda Plan and this blockade very quickly, right at the start of the war in 1861. So that's for that check on learning. Next, we're going to go on to what's more important, other more important battles in the Civil War. For the first Bull Run, the operational setup, rebels used telegraph and railroads to get reinforcements before and during battle. So what's important to know about the first Bull Run, all you have to know basically is that the telegraph and railroads were very important to deliver reinforcements and supplies both before and during the battle. Again, this is how telegraphs and railroads are so effective at the operational level. So the first Bull Run is an example of the positive impact of railroads and telegraphs on Civil War campaigns, and this was demonstrated in the first big Eastern battle, known as First Bull Run. Next, for Grant's Western advance and the stalls that happened after Shiloh. So Fort Henry and Donelson fell to the Union. The Union won Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and that allowed them to have access to the river that went all the way into the Deep South. And so things were looking very good for the Union. They followed this river all the way into the Deep South that they had gained access to, and then they got kind of complacent, and they didn't have very good security once they were at Shiloh, and that enabled the rebels to launch a surprise attack, which killed a lot of Union soldiers, and Grant did eventually win. However, he lost a lot. It was a very costly victory for him because his security was so low after going through this river. I guess he was overly confident, and so the Confederates surprised them and just slaughtered a bunch of Union soldiers. As a result of the Battle of Shiloh, which Grant won, the Union won the Battle of Shiloh. However, it was very costly, and it made them lose a lot of time. And so it slowed down their offensive maneuver through the South. So while Grant did win this, it was a very costly victory, and it slowed him down a lot as he was trying to move through the South. And this was all because he had poor security here, because he became complacent after the victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and he allowed the Confederacy to get the element of surprise on him. And the main thing here is to know that Grant did win this battle at Shiloh. However, it slowed him down a lot because it was a very costly victory for him. He lost a lot, especially time. He lost a lot of time in this battle. Next, as far as Bragg's goes, he had a failed Kentucky campaign, and the reason for this was due to legitimacy. he realized, or he thought at least, that in Kentucky there was a lot of people who sympathized with the rebels and who wanted to be in the Confederacy, and he figured that if he got to Kentucky, he would get a lot of support from people there because he thought that people in Kentucky just loved the Confederacy and wanted to be in the Confederacy. So he went to Kentucky, and he did very poorly there. He did so poorly, eventually he had to retreat out of Kentucky because he was wrong. A lot of local people did not support the Confederacy and didn't want to be in the Confederacy and didn't want to support the Confederacy. So for that reason, he had very poor support from people in Kentucky, which led to poor supplies, poor logistics, and he had very costly stalemated battle where he didn't really lose per se against the Union, but he was in not the most friendly of territory, and he was losing a lot of people, a lot of supplies. He didn't have abilities to resupply, and so if he would have stayed, he probably would have lost a lot more. And so even though he was at kind of a stalemate, he decided to retreat from Kentucky because if he had stayed there much longer, he probably would have done considerable more damage to the Confederacy if he would have stayed, because he was wrong. And in Kentucky, people did not sympathize with the Confederacy. That's what's most important to realize here, is that in Kentucky, people did not like the Confederacy, but Braggs thought that they would, and so he went to Kentucky expecting people to give him lots of support, and he did not get it, and for that reason he had to retreat out of Kentucky. Then for McClellan and his attempt to take Richmond, McClellan is actually known as being one of, if not the worst general in American history. He had a consistent failure of offensive when trying to take Richmond for the Union. Eventually, Lee took command of the rebel army outside of Richmond, and Robert E. Lee was known as being very offensive. Now, the definition of offensive, whenever they use the word offensive as one of the important aspects of war, is offensive means retaining and exploiting territory. You want to seize the territory, then retain it, and then exploit the initiative. And so when they use the word offensive, they're evaluating how effectively a general seized something, retained it, and then exploited the initiative. And General Robert E. Lee was very good at doing this. He repeatedly attacked the Union and eventually forced them to retreat. And because of this reason, McClellan was not able to take Richmond, Virginia, because McClellan was, like I said, one of the worst generals in American history. He's known for being, and he failed at using the topic of offensive. Right? So there's the maneuver, there's unity of command, there's security, and one of the other ones that we talk about is offensive, right? Which means, like I said, seizing, retaining, and exploiting the initiative. McClellan was always too slow and cautious to be very good at using offensive measures. For that reason, he failed at taking Richmond, and Robert E. Lee took advantage of that and exploited it. And so Robert E. Lee is the opposite of McClellan in that he is very effective at using offensive techniques. Robert E. Lee is very good at seizing, retaining, and exploiting initiatives in war. So what's testable here that you want to know is that Lee would seize, retain, and exploit the initiative if given the chance, and McClellan gave him the chance at Richmond. The second sub-bullet that's testable: outside of Richmond, Lee attacked McClellan in fights collectively known as the 7 Days Battle. McClellan was very anxious. He was very weak-minded, a very weak and poor general. Eventually, Lincoln had to fire him, and he ended up retreating because Robert E. Lee was so offensive in his battle techniques of seizing, retaining, and exploiting that eventually McClellan had to retreat, and Richmond was under the control of the Confederacy, and the Union failed to take it because of McClellan retreating due to how well Lee used the offensive. So that Lee was very offensive, and that led to McClellan retreating from Richmond. Then in Maryland, McClellan again failed at using the offensive. Lee's army got hurt, but it was still intact. They ended up retreating south. So even though Lee fell short in Maryland, he was still intact. His army was still intact and could live to fight another day. They retreated, and the big thing that's important about the battle at Maryland between Lee and McClellan is that it what led to the Emancipation Proclamation. After the battle in Maryland, where Lee had to retreat, Lincoln drew up the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all slaves in the Confederacy, but not in the North. And people questioned why this was, and they talk about it here. They say the reason for the Emancipation Proclamation was that Lincoln wanted to, of course, cripple the Confederacy by freeing all the slaves in the Confederacy, but not in the North, because if he would have freed slaves in the North, then he would have lost places like Maryland and Kentucky that were still slave states but were in the Union. So the Union still had some states that were slave states, and Lincoln realized that if he would have freed all slaves, then he would have lost support of some of his states in the Union. So instead, he just freed slaves in the Confederacy. Another benefit of doing this was that it gave moral leverage to the war. It convinced Europe that they shouldn't support the South because what the South was doing was immoral. Europe was already kind of on the fence on how they felt about slave government, and they kind of were uncomfortable with the idea of recognizing the South and recognizing the Confederacy as its own nation because they didn't really feel that great about slavery at that time. And so the Emancipation Proclamation kind of showed to Europe that the North was in the moral high ground here. And so basically the result of the Emancipation Proclamation was that it convinced Europe not to side with the Confederacy and not to side with the South, which was a really big concern for both sides during the war. The South wanted Europe to be on their side. The North did not want Europe to be on the side of the Confederacy. And as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, they assured that Europe would not side with the Confederacy. Also, what's important to note here is that the reason the Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves from the Confederacy was that Lincoln didn't want to lose support of the states in the Union that were still slave states. Like Maryland was one of them, and then Kentucky was the other one. So he didn't want to lose Kentucky and Maryland, which were part of the Union at the time. And so the Emancipation Proclamation, again, only freed slaves in the Confederacy. Very important to understand that. Also understand that the Emancipation Proclamation prevented Europe from aligning with the South and recognizing the South as its own nation because Europe didn't really agree with slavery. And so whenever President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation making slavery illegal in the Confederacy, it showed that they kind of had some kind of moral high ground here, which helped them to gain support from Europe. That's what's important about the Emancipation Proclamation. You can read all about it here. It has the notes here explaining all this stuff. Then lastly, Grant takes Vicksburg. What's important here, again, was that there was excellent maneuvering techniques that Grant used here, and also joint operations. Whenever Vicksburg fell to the Union, it was because Ulysses S. Grant had very effective coordination between Army and Navy, because Vicksburg was on the river, on the Mississippi River, and the Union was trying to take over control of the Mississippi River. It was a very low-cost operation. Grant didn't lose a lot. He didn't have to invest a lot. And because of the fall of Vicksburg, the Union was able to control the Mississippi River, which was a huge victory for the Union. It was almost like a decisive operation here. Once they had control of the Mississippi River, they severed the Confederacy in half. They separated the East from the West, and now there was no line of communication of supplies in the Confederacy. It really disrupted their line of communication. Most of the ammunition and arms were manufactured in the east for the Confederacy, and so now that they controlled the Mississippi River, they couldn't get those ammunition and arms and supplies to the West Confederacy, to the states in the west of the Confederacy. So when the Mississippi River fell, the Union was able to basically put the nail in the coffin for the Confederacy. So the fall of Vicksburg is really important. Understand that the reason it was possible was because Grant used maneuvering very effectively, and he was able to very effectively use joint operations between the Army and the Navy. Also understand this was very low cost for Grant. He didn't lose much, he didn't invest much, and it was a huge victory because it allowed him to control the entire Mississippi River for the Union. Alright, this is the last battle now. Chancellorsville. We talk about what was good for Robert E. Lee and what was bad for Robert E. Lee. Lee had a masterful use of several principles of war, most importantly maneuver. Again, he very effectively maneuvered at Chancellorsville. However, what was bad about this was that it was a late day envelopment, and it was very costly. So it took a lot of time. It wasn't very simple, right? It violated the rule of simplicity. It was overly complicated, and so it took a lot of time for them to execute it. So it took place late in the day, which was kind of a bad part of this strategy. It also frustrated the Union Army, but wasn't able to completely crush it. So what's important here, we're going to go over it. So fourth bullet here for what was bad for Lee, what's testable. Maneuvering was very effective here because they were able to envelop the right flank of the Union. It took all day to set up because it was so complicated, so it didn't actually start until late afternoon. It shocked the Yankees, and the attack had to be rushed and led to a lot of confusion, which contributed to some friendly fire on the side of the Confederacy because it was so overly complicated, it took so much time, and then had to be quickly executed. People were confused, and so for that reason, that was kind of a bad part of the Chancellorsville campaign here, this battle that happened. Then, even though Lee was able to wreck the Union's plan of establishing essentially a feint where they were going to attack from the east, but that was the secondary measure, and the primary measure was an attack from the west, and they were going to distract everybody by attacking from the east, and then they were going to have the actual attack be on the west once all the Confederacy was to the east. However, this plan didn't really work out because Lee was so effective at maneuvering his people and enveloping the Union. But what was bad about this battle was that it took so much time that it wasn't actually executed until late in the afternoon. And Lee wasn't able to totally annihilate the army in this case. He was able to hurt them pretty bad, but he didn't essentially seize any key terrain during this part of the war, and he wasn't able to really annihilate the army in this area. So for that reason, it wasn't a complete success. While he did effectively maneuver and prevent the Union from completely destroying his forces in the area, he didn't really achieve a huge success because he didn't establish any key terrain. the Union still held high ground, and he also wasn't able to completely eradicate the Union army in the area here. So it wasn't a complete success for those reasons. What's important to note here is that it was such a complicated technique that Robert E. Lee was using that it took all day to execute. It wasn't until late in the day, in the afternoon, that they were able to actually go forward with the plan. And even when they did, it had to be rushed, and a lot of people were confused because it was such a complicated tactic that Robert E. Lee had planned. However, it was somewhat successful, again, because it prevented the Union from completely destroying Lee's forces. However, Lee wasn't that successful because he didn't seize any key terrain, and he didn't completely annihilate the Union forces at the time. So it was kind of a stalemate, really, at Chancellorsville, is what they want you to know. We can, I want to emphasize what's important in these notes, because the notes kind of explain what they want you to know about what's highlighted in red here. So as far as the fourth bullet goes, we talked about this. The plan didn't start until late in the afternoon. It shocked the Yankees, but it led to a very rushed attack and was very confusing to Lee's forces because it was so complicated that a lot of people didn't exactly understand what they were supposed to do. Another thing that's testable here is that Lee did prevent Hooker, which was the commander of the Union forces. He prevented the Union forces from completely annihilating him and his forces. However, even though he prevented the Union from annihilating him, he wasn't able to completely crush the Union army, and he wasn't able to seize any key terrain or basically make any headway or any significant advantages for the overall war for the Confederates. So it was kind of a stalemate again, right? He basically Lee defended himself effectively from complete annihilation, but at the same time he wasn't able to seize any more terrain, and he wasn't able to really annihilate the Union forces in the area. So again, it was kind of a stalemate. Even though Lee was masterful in using the principle of maneuvering here, he had an overly complicated plan that wasn't executed until late afternoon. A lot of people were confused about what they were supposed to do because it was so complicated, and even though it kind of frustrated and hurt the Union army, it didn't completely eradicate them, and Lee didn't gain any decisive terrain. So again, it was kind of a stalemate. Alright, and now we can talk about the battle at Gettysburg. What's important to know here is that there were problems basically with the rebels' timing. Same thing that we saw before with Chancellorsville. Lee's plan had to be very complicated. For that reason, it wasn't executed until late in the day. And again, he wasn't able to seize any key terrain. And this was the second day. So for the test, all you need to know about is the second day, what's in red, for the Battle of Gettysburg. And in the notes here, it tells you what they want you to understand about this. Basically, it didn't start until mid-afternoon. The delays allowed the Yankees to occupy high ground. So because it took them so long to execute this plan, the Union had time to occupy high ground, which gave them the advantage and had key terrain. And then the rebels, the Confederates, weren't able to attack until late in the evening. And the Yankees, by this time, the Union had time to prepare. They had time to hold high ground and gain key decisive terrain. And so for this reason, the Confederates were not successful at Gettysburg because of timing problems, which allowed the Union to gain key terrain, because it took the Confederates so much time to plan and execute their battle techniques that they were going to use here. It kind of took too much time. It wasn't very effective. And that's why the Confederates were not successful at the Battle of Gettysburg. Alright, so this is a long check on learning. We're going to go through each one. So, did Grant violate security at Shiloh? Yes, he did, because he became complacent, remember, after going down the river all the way to the south, and that allowed the Confederates to surprise him the Confederates used the principle of surprise very effectively and hurt Grant really bad. He still did win, though. However, it was a very costly victory for Grant, and it slowed down his movement through the South, very much so. He had high casualties, and his advance through the South decelerated. It slowed down. And then when Bragg went north into Kentucky, did he have the legitimacy to secure Kentuckian support? No, he didn't. Bragg was very surprised that when he went to Kentucky, a lot of people did not sympathize with the Confederacy, and so he didn't get much support. And for that reason, he didn't have much logistical support whenever he was in Kentucky, and so eventually he had to retreat from Kentucky. So that issue did end his campaign because he had no support there, and for that he had no logistical support, no legitimacy in Kentucky. Then, did Lee use offensive a lot to defend Richmond in the 7 Days Battle? Yes. So that's what's so important about Richmond, Virginia in the 7 Days Battle. It's how he got the Union to retreat. Right, McClellan was the commander for the Union, and he got McClellan to retreat because he used offensive so much. Lee's battle techniques used the principle of offensiveness so much, where he was seizing, retaining, and exploiting initiatives, that eventually McClellan had to retreat from Richmond. So Lee was very offensive at Richmond, which allowed him to win the 7 Days Battle. Then, did McClellan use offensive even better at Antietam to destroy Lee's army and inspire full emancipation? So, if you remember, Battle of Antietam is what inspired not full emancipation, but emancipation for only the slaves in the Confederacy. McClellan wasn't very good at using offensive, the principle of offensive. We can go back to Antietam. Alright, so what's important to know here is that McClellan did not use offensive well, right? McClellan never uses offensive well. Anytime you see a question asking if McClellan used offensive well, he did not. McClellan sucked at using the principle of offensive. Robert E. Lee's army was hurt at Antietam, but it was still intact, and he had to retreat farther south. This led to the political impact of the Emancipation Proclamation here. So, for this last question at the bottom of this slide, did McClellan use offensive better at Antietam to destroy Lee's army? No, he did not use offensive, and Lee's army was not destroyed. Lee's army was hurt, and so they retreated, but it wasn't destroyed. And did it inspire full emancipation? No, it did not inspire full emancipation. At this time, Lincoln had to come up with a compromise where he wouldn't lose the states in the Union that still had slaves, but he did want to hurt the Confederates, and he wanted to convince the Europeans not to side with Confederates because Europeans understood that slavery was terrible and they didn't want to side with the South. And so whenever Lincoln made slavery illegal for the Confederacy, he essentially prevented Europe from aligning with the Confederacy and from recognizing the Confederacy as its own nation. So that's what's important about here. McClellan, again, did not use offensive ever, and because of this, he failed to completely destroy Lee's army, and he did not inspire full emancipation, only part emancipation. Emancipation, again, for the slaves in the Confederacy. Next it asks, did Grant use naval help and maneuver well to take Vicksburg? Yes, Grant used maneuver very well at Vicksburg. He also used the help of the Navy, so he was able to use both the Navy and the Army to help him take Vicksburg. There was a low-cost campaign for Grant. Remember, Grant didn't have to invest a lot into this campaign, and he didn't lose a lot in this campaign. His win did give the Union full control of the Mississippi River, so after Vicksburg fell, the Union had full support of the Mississippi River, And then the next question here is, did Lee use maneuver well at Chancellorsville? Yes, he did, right? Lee used maneuver very well. Hooker, who was the commander for the Union, tried to do a feint, tried to trick Lee by sending some troops in at the west and then sent the main body of troops in at the east. So while Lee was supposed to be distracted at the west, he sent the rest of the troops in at the east, trying to envelop Lee. However, this failed as Lee was very effective at using maneuvering to foil Hooker's plan. However, the downside of this was that the techniques that Lee used were so complicated that they weren't able to execute this plan until late in the day, late in the afternoon, because it was so complicated. And it was so complicated that a lot of people had trouble understanding what they were supposed to be doing. And there was a lot of confusion, and it was a very rushed battle. By the time they got ready to actually execute, it had to be rushed because they lost so much time just planning this overcomplicated maneuvering technique. However, it was an effective maneuver, right? They did not, however, Lee was not able to completely crush the Union army at this point in time, and he was not able to seize any key terrain. So it was kind of a stalemate, right? The Union failed to destroy Lee, and Lee failed to destroy the Union, but he did basically defend himself, and he was able to live to fight another day after this. Okay, but he didn't seize any key terrain at Chancellorsville, and he was not able to completely crush the Union army. Then, lastly, did Lee use maneuver as well at Gettysburg? So, again, at Gettysburg, his technique of maneuver occurred late in the day because it was so overly complicated. But because Lee took so much time making this plan, he gave the Union Army a lot of time. And because the Union Army had so much time, they were able to gain key terrain that was on high ground. And eventually Gettysburg was a disaster for the Confederates because while Lee did use maneuvering techniques well, it took him so much time to plan that he lost so much time that the Union Army took advantage of that, and they gained key terrain, which was the high ground, and the Union Army was successful. So to review this, we can look at what was important about the second day at Gettysburg. Lee had difficulties with a timely envelopment against the Union left flank. It didn't start until late in the day. The delays allowed the Union to occupy high ground, which was key terrain. And because the Union had so much time, they were able to occupy key terrain, which ended up becoming a disaster for the Confederates. So that's everything that's important from Lesson 3. Whenever you go through these PowerPoint slides, make sure that you are able to answer the checks on learning, because those check on learnings come from the question on the test. So make sure you understand those checks on learning.